I found ways to talk about Series 1 of Peep Show so many times in my videos. I think there's just something about even trivial little things in that early 2000s time period that gives me so much nostalgia. But today I'm going to be looking at something even older than Peep Show's first episode. Hell, I'm going back to a point where Peep Show wasn't even called Peep Show. This is the final amended draft script of the pilot episode of POV, which was the working title of the show before it eventually became Peep Show. And just for reference, Peep Show's proper TV debut, the original airing of Warring Factions, was on the 19th of September 2003, so less than a year after this draft was finalised. In this video I'm going to go over some of the key differences between this final draft of POV and what we actually got in Peep Show's full finalised debut, Series 1's Warring Factions. I say key differences because this really is a full script of a TV show episode, 78 pages long in fact, and there's no way I can feasibly cover every single difference because there are a lot of changes here, both big and small, so I provided a link to the full script in the description in case you want to fully read it over and get a better grasp of things for yourself. Also, just before I begin, it's probably worth clarifying what the amendments and annotations mean on this script. Things written in blue are new additions to the final draft revision, things crossed out have been removed from the previous revision, and VO stands for voiceover, so those lines are the internal thoughts you hear from Mark and Jez. Oh, and I'll refer to this pilot script as POV, and the episode we eventually got as Peep Show, just to keep things easier to say. So our first big difference comes in the very first scene, as it's not Jez dancing around to Sophie You Tell, but rather it's the scene with Mark running to the bus. Mark's Lord of the Bus said he run wouldn't feel complete normally without the Lighthouse family playing in the background, who are a staple of Peep Show's first series. However, the song originally intended for here was actually Nina Simone's recording of Cinnamon. Now I don't know if you're familiar with this song, it is very well known, but it's not very Mark-like, in my opinion. For a man whose musical breadth barely extends past Snow Patrol and the Beatles, I don't know if I buy that Mark would be listening to this song, whereas I do believe he'd be listening to the Lighthouse family, because, well, who didn't love a bit of Ocean Drive in the early 2000s? Instead of Sophie being behind Mark like in Peep Show, POV had Sophie already be on the bus, and instead of the awkward moment of her sitting on his hand, it's a little more extreme than that. Mark instead thinks Sophie's having a fit and tries to heroically save her by shoving his hand in her mouth to try and grab her tongue. But she wasn't having a fit, and thus is completely fine, which just makes him look like a weirdo. He thought she was having a fit because her head suddenly jolted back, but it was actually caused by a toddler pulling on her hair. This is kinda hard to imagine being played out due to being so different to Peep Show. The directions say her head suddenly jerks back weirdly, something unusual is happening, yet we know that nothing is actually wrong with her. I'd be interested to know how exactly they were intending to make it look like it could be believed Sophie was having a fit here by having her hair pulled, because that doesn't sound easy to do convincingly. Maybe they just felt it looked a bit too over the top for the very first scene in the show or something, and changed it to something more down to earth, or relatively awkward that was easier for the audience to understand. In another video of mine, I pointed out that the person sat behind Mark and Sophie on this bus is actually one of the show's writers, Jesse Armstrong, with his son. And in POV script, this character actually has a line and says sorry to Sophie over the hair pulling. So maybe that's why Jesse and his son are playing these roles, because they actually played a part at one point rather than just kind of being there in the background. Though I guess I should note that the POV script includes a number of alternative scenes at the end, one of which is basically the finalised version of this bus scene that we eventually got in Peep Show, with all of the hand-sitting action that we're familiar with. So I guess that's kind of interesting, that the scene that eventually ended up in the final episode was already finalised by the time that the pilot was written, yet it was deemed as the inferior version. And remember, there's less than a year between this script for POV being finalised and Peep Show first airing, so there definitely was not too much time for big changes in the script like this to happen. Jeremy's dancing scene is played after Mark's bus scene, so these two really were just switched around for Peep Show. So Futile is described as crap sub-moby electronica in the POV script, which is just fucking hilarious, and we can also see some very rare unheard lyrics here too. Better watch out, cause I'll give you a shock, I've got your stupid mother head in a musical headlock. These are never heard in Peep Show, not even in the full music video for So Futile that was available on the DVD extras for Series 1. Things are mostly the same from here until Mark and Jez start talking about the invitation they received to Tony's party. I guess something notable was that it was seemingly only a late decision that Tony was going to be Mark and Jeremy's neighbour. As you can see in this draft, multiple lines were changed that allude to her living both above and below their floors in Apollo House. That's kinda interesting, I guess, as Tony's close proximity to Mark and Jez by being next door to them is one of the main reasons we actually see so much of her in Peep Show's first series. The scene in which Mark gets knocked over and Tony starts talking about Alpen is pretty much identical, however something to note is that Mark is specifically noted as wearing a Holston Pills t-shirt, which is a beer if you're not familiar with it. He doesn't actually wear this in Peep Show, however, Holston Pills is specifically mentioned in Series 8 Episode 6 Quantocking 2, in which it stated that Mark has a Holston Pills keyring. So there, That's something, I guess. It was established Mark liked Holston pills all the way back in the pilot, and it only took 48 episodes for that to be brought up again. Tony was originally going to eat Alpen from a cup, which is a bit weird, and when Jez is walking into the flat before he finds Mark and Tony laughing at his track, his pretend Grammy acceptance speech doesn't just mention his homeboys in Compton and the Japanese people, but also the Chinese, Tibetans and Gurkhas. It's weird because this isn't actually crossed out in the script, yet Jez doesn't mention any of those other three in the full episode of Peep Show. Maybe they specifically cut those lines down when filming or something, because that would be a lot of people to shout out during the short walk from the front door to Jeremy's bedroom. The next scene with some notable things in it is the first time that we see Hans when he meets Jez at the pub and doesn't want logo in the foam of his Guinness. The Velvet Underground's I'm Waiting for the Man was originally playing in the background of the pub, and Hans had more dialogue, going on a tirade about Sting. Then, when Mark is being abused by the kids that call him Clean Shirt, a line was cut in which it stated that he failed GCSE biology, which is kinda interesting. Maybe that plays in with the fact that he didn't know leukemia was a form of cancer during his conversation with Tony. In the Meet Judas scene, there's something kinda cool if you remember your super obscure lines of dialogue. The Judas conversation makes Mark bring up Big Suze to Jez, which will be the earliest mention of her if it was actually in the episode of Peep Show. However, Mark says, "Is this why you filled in her name in every single answer in your Mega Puzzler?" Which is very, very similar to a line that Jez says to Mark in Series 2's wedding. "You wrote her name on every single egg under the word bird." These lines being so alike and both being in such a similar context means that I have no doubts that Jeremy's word bird line is either a reference to this original line, or it's just the same idea actually being used. This Judas scene in POV goes on for much longer than it does in Peep Show, and the conversation eventually leads to a really interesting line from Mark, perhaps the most interesting in the entire pilot. And that when I asked you to move in here, Paul said I shouldn't because you're lazy and tight. The obvious question here being, who the fuck is Paul? Was Paul someone Mark had lived with before? Is Paul a friend of Mark's who is going to have a bigger role? Honestly, I have no idea, because there's nobody in Peep Show that fit this role of being someone that Mark would consult about Jeremy's living situation. But whoever this Paul is, they aren't referenced anywhere else in POV script outside of this one time. In a way, this mention feels kinda similar to the way that Pedge is brought up in Peep Show, a character we know basically nothing about that somehow knows Mark and Jez, though we're not really sure how or why, and he's never seen in person. Now we cut to the scene that starts with Jez and Mark waiting outside Tony's door. Turns out this episode is called Warring Factions because not only do Mark and Jez argue a lot in this draft, but Jez actually says no need to be warring factions. I also find it interesting here that Mark and Jez had their lines directly swapped in this scene, as is evident by the change in names in the script. The door opens to reveal a sexily dressed Tony. I wonder if Sam and Jessie had the weird Japanese kimono type thing she wears in Peep Show in mind when they wrote sexily dressed. Also, Dr. Dre's The Next Episode was meant to play when she opens the door. That doesn't seem very fitting. But hey, the script actually acknowledges this. Tony nods her head to the inappropriate gangster rap. Jeremy and Mark try to join in. There's another line here that's seemingly reused in a later episode, like the word bird one that I mentioned earlier. Though unlike that one where the line is just somewhat similar, this one is an exact copy. Mark says, Ernest and Julio, fictional obviously, when talking about wine in POV, which is the exact same line he uses in Series 2's The Man Show. I wonder if Sam and Jessie just kept track of all these little offhand lines of dialogue that were cut when transitioning from POV to Peep Show and tried to insert them throughout the show to make sure they got used after all. Also, you know that weird bit in Peep Show's version of Warring Factions where Mark calls Jez a twat? Yes, not a twat, a twat. That is actually written in POV script as twat. Is that a thing people say? Twat? It was written intentionally, so I guess. It's not something I've heard anyone say outside of maybe people that aren't from the UK mispronouncing it or something. During the Rizzler game, Jeremy was apparently at one point going to write King on his Rizzler to stick on Mark's head. Not really sure what the joke was there, or even if there was one. Is it just a reference to king-size Rizzlers or something? But the same happens here in POV as does in Peep Show, that a random old lady gets Jez's Rizzler, or nice-looking, somewhat pissed 60-year-old as the script labels her. As I stated before in a video I did about random pieces of Peep Show trivia, this woman's name is Davina, which is never stated in dialogue during the POV pilot, nor in the actual episode itself. She has more lines than she does in the final version of Peep Show, which is probably why Jeremy just blurts out the "look, you're a cockmuncher" line, as he's obviously annoyed by her constantly bothering him while he's trying to pull Paula. The scene in which Mark tries to seduce Tony was going to have Peter Gabriel's Don't Give Up with Kate Bush. It seems like Tony really has a thing for Peter Gabriel. As you may remember in On the Pull from Series 1, she can't stop ranting about him to Jeremy after Valerie insulted him. As you can probably tell by now, music choices like this really are one of the big differences between POV script and Warring Factions as broadcast in Peep Show. There's a lot more recognisable and culturally relevant music featured in POV as opposed to the mostly stock music in Peep Show. I guess money is the key factor in those things being removed though, rather than it being some sort of artistic choice. With Peep Show being as low budget as it was, combined with this awkward filming style, I don't imagine there was much money left to throw around licensing Peter Gabriel, Dr. Dre and the Velvet Underground for such minor reasons. But I definitely don't think that that's a bad thing. Peep Show's music is kinda quirky and different, plus it means that when you do actually get recognisable songs popping up, like the Orinoco Flow in Series 1, they're really pretty interesting and memorable. When Jez is talking to Paula back in his bedroom, he was going to be messing around on his keyboard with his voice sampled saying cool, whereas in Peep Show he just hits 3 random keys that sound, well, like 3 random keys. I'm not sure why they got rid of the cool thing, as that probably would have been a cool thing, or at least it would have been more audibly interesting than what actually happens. When Mark returns to the party after failing to buy alcohol and enough nachos to feed the Mexican army, Van Morrison's Madame George was going to be playing. Another instance of a music choice that was never actually used in Peep Show, but also another instance of a musician that would eventually be mentioned at least. Stephanie, the woman from Mark's course in Series 8, started talking about Van Morrison just before Mark walked out on her. God, what a mistake that was. Then, something kind of interesting in the POV script is that we get a version A and a version B of a bit of dialogue from Jeremy. They're both variations on the line he says when he's trying to justify not giving Mark the number for the Chinese doctor, which in itself is one of the parts of the episode that I just don't think works very well, even in the finalised version. Version B was used in Peep Show, which I say was probably the better piece of dialogue though. Jeremy's blunt take on acupuncture is funny, but I've never really got the point of name dropping this Dr. Tang character that we don't know anything about and is never mentioned again and doesn't mean anything to the audience. The characters all act shocked when Jez says he didn't give Mark Dr. Tang's number, but as a viewer I'm not sure exactly why this is a big deal or why I should care. That's kind of off topic I guess, but it's one of the criticisms that I have of Warring Factions. And that is the end of the major notable differences between POV script and Peep Show. The episode ends in the same way the final episode does, with Mark chasing after the kids with a bit of metal, which is apparently a piece of scaffolding, the more you know. I know that was pretty long, but hopefully it was somewhat interesting to watch. As you can tell, there were lots of changes, both big and small, and they kinda let you know what direction Peep Show possibly could have gone in. In POV script, Mark and Jez seem a lot less friendly with each other. They seem to be at each other's necks a bit more, and they seem a bit less tolerant of one another's quirks, and thus that's where the name Warring Factions came from. As I said at the start of the video, I'll leave a link in the description to a copy of the full script so that you can read it for yourself if you're interested. Obviously I couldn't mention every single tiny change between the two scripts in this episode, so you might be interested in reading it to see some of the smaller dialogue changes. But yeah, thanks for watching.